Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Again, I wanted to apologize for having this bottle of cola right next to me here. Most likely I will need it because my voice gets dried out rather quickly from one of the meds I'm taking for my autism. There is no cure for autism, as I'm sure you know, but there are meds that can help with some of the symptoms like anxiety and whatnot, which I do have. But with with these meds, they really work wonders, except for the fact that the mirtazapine, aka Remeron, dries out my mouth. So that's the reason for the cola. Okay, now on to the subject. I wanted to create a kind of synthesis of Maoism, third worldism, and intersectional Marxism, and then apply that to the situation between Israel and Gaza. Situation between Israel and Gaza has been going on for months and months, and there does not appear to be any immediate resolution to it. It is very sad for all the Gazans that are suffering, are homeless, are being killed on a daily basis. There was an attack just today on Rafah, which might indicate future attacks on Rafah. We do know that Israel would like to push the remaining Gazans in Rafah into an area that has been or is being created for them in Egypt, which would literally be a transcontinental journey. Since Gaza is in Asia and Egypt is in Africa, they would literally be moving from one continent to another. And that is a forced move. And I suppose you could call it a kind of genocide. And I think it is rather sad that that is happening to those poor people that I love a great deal, the Gazans. And as a Maoist third worldist, I always put the third world at the center of my thinking and not the first world. I live in the first world and I know how corrupt it is. And the third world has its share of corruption as well, but not the same type as we have in the first world, not the same kind of imperialism which dominates the world. The capitalist world system is centered in the first world, and that means that imperialism is centered in the first world as well. And so I wish nothing but the best, nothing but happiness, nothing but prosperity to my fellow human beings in Gaza, to my fellow Semites in Gaza, and that the long war between the Palestinians and Israelis, really going back to 1948 and even earlier, comes to a swift end, and that there is a single Palestine from the river to the sea, a Palestine that would hopefully include anyone who wants to live there, whether Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druzes, or anyone else. It would not be a closed Palestine, I hope. Now, of course, I would not be the person to make that decision, but I don't believe in national borders. I believe that people should be free to travel from one place to another with literally no restrictions placed upon them. So ideally, that would be the situation that I would want to see in Palestine. Not a two-state solution, but a one-state solution, a single Palestine. Will that happen? Eventually, I think, But as long as the first world, which includes Israel, dominates the world, I think that that kind of situation is really, really, really unlikely. And that brings tremendous sadness to my heart because I feel intersubjectively connected to the Gazans. I don't know them. I have known a Gazan, my former dentist, as I've previously mentioned, but I don't know the people in Gaza right now, obviously. I'm here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, but I would like to know them. I really would. I would like to know them, to meet them, anything I could do to help them. But sadly, there's nothing really I can do. I can't stop the war. I simply have no power to do so. But I would want to apologize to Gazans as somebody from a Jewish background, although I am not a part of the war against Gaza personally. I feel a personal responsibility toward Gaza nonetheless, and for that matter, toward Palestine in general, and for that matter, toward Iran. And I would like to apologize to those areas as a person of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, and to hope that your situation gets better, that you live happy and successful lives, that your children live happy and successful lives, and the same for all of their descendants, because the current situation there is obviously not good. So, what I wanted to do here, as I said, is to create a kind of synthesis between Maoism, Third Worldism, and intersectional Marxism. I have discussed intersectional Marxism 2 or 3 times already here. It should not be confused with intersectionality in general as it was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and then later amplified by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, who is now a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand when it comes to intersectionality is that when Crenshaw developed it, her intention was not to develop a theory, but to develop a model. I have listened to Crenshaw discuss this. She said that she was trying to come up with a way of understanding inequality. And an image came to her of a highway map, a road map, and all the intersecting roads and highways on that map. And she thought that that was a very good and useful illustration of the way in which the world operates today. What Ashley Borer did is she took the basic idea of intersectionality and she turned it into a Marxist theory. Now, my views and Borer's views are not precisely the same, but they are close enough. And so what I will be doing is presenting my own version of Marxist intersectionality or intersectional Marxism, whatever you want to call it, and showing how that can illuminate our understanding of Maoism, Third Worldism. First, let's explain again in more detail what is intersectional Marxism. First, the concept of intersectionality, the roadmap, the highway map, That is the capitalist world system. That is imperialism. That is the first world that we see in positions of power and dominance everywhere. The US, my own country, is at the head of that capitalist world system. The US enjoys relatively unchallenged dominance over that system and has since the end of World War II. Before then, it was Britain that was in a position of power, and before Britain, it was France. But right now, the capitalist world system, which began in the shipping industry in the late 19th century, shipping made it possible to transport goods from one continent to another with relative ease, something which had not been possible in the past. But suddenly, now it was. And so capitalism was suddenly no longer simply a local thing. Suddenly, capitalism was global. And that is sometimes called Fordism, named after the unfortunate individual Henry Ford. I say unfortunate individual because Henry Ford was a virulent anti-Semite, something which you may or may not know. He was very active in promoting anti-Semitism. Of course, that was a long time ago. I certainly do not blame the current Ford Motor Company for the actions and beliefs of Henry Ford. I see them as they're different. I mean, you can't blame people and for the actions of their ancestors. Well, I guess you could, but doing so, I think, would be immensely fair. You know, like, should I be blamed for the fact that my father beat me? No, of course not. That would be silly. The same way, I don't think that we can blame the current Ford Motor Company on the beliefs and activities of Henry Ford. That was a long time ago, about 100 years ago. Nevertheless, Ford and other people who began manufacturing automobiles and selling them on a global level, that was possible because suddenly there was global capitalism. Previous to that, capitalism was local. You went to a local store. I have seen that global capitalism increase even over the course of my lifetime. I remember as a kid driving with my parents throughout the United States, stopping in different cities and towns along the way, and seeing entirely different stores, entirely different gas stations. The styles of home construction were very different. That is still true to an extent with older homes. But much of that is gone. When you travel around the US now, you might as well be anywhere. When I moved from Olathe, Kansas to Mission, Texas, aside from the more Mexican American areas, and there are some of those here, we had no Mexican American areas in Olathe, Kansas. I wish we did. I like Mexican American areas and Mexican American culture, and I've grown to appreciate it even more since I've been here. But we had those, we didn't have those in Kansas, but the stores, exactly the same. The gas stations, almost exactly the same. There are few chains of gas stations we don't have. The supermarkets, no, with the exception of the Walmart supermarkets. HEB is the major supermarket chain in this area, and it is entirely a local supermarket chain. The banks, almost exactly the same, with one or two exceptions. That's global capitalism. I knew this guy back when I lived in Wise, Virginia. Most likely you've never heard of Wise, Virginia. It is a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of extreme southwestern Virginia, right at the intersection between Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And it is literally out in the middle of nowhere. I did not like it as a native New Yorker, someone born in Manhattan, raised in the Bronx and Queens. It was a very difficult thing for me to be there. And so, literally, as soon as I got there, I thought, I've got to get out of this place. I've got to get out. I took the job because it was my first permanent tenure track position. I did have one other professorship before then, but that was only a maternity leave position. And so when that time ended, I had to leave. I had no choice but to leave. I found this job in the Appalachian Mountains, and although I didn't like the place, the people seemed friendly, and they were friendly for the most part. And I immersed myself in my work. And so I tried to stop thinking about where I was as much as possible. But globalization was beginning to occur in this small town of approximately 1,200 people. Tiny town, very, very tiny town. When I went there were basically no large stores, with the exception of Food Lion, which I believe is a part of Kroger, although I might be mistaken on that, and Lowe's. That was it. Besides that, there were no other national chains. Oh, and Hardee's. There was a Hardee's there as well. My last year living in Wise, fortunately, because I got another position, another professorship, which actually paid less than the one I already had, but I took it because it was an opportunity to leave the area. A Kmart, of course, now Kmart is practically forgotten. There are very, very few Kmarts left in the United States right now. But a Kmart and a Walmart opened up right near Wise. Suddenly, in the space of approximately a month, the entire downtown area of Wise was shut down. All the buildings were boarded up. There was nothing left of it. I had a friend who owned a store that was affiliated, kind of, with Radio Shack. It wasn't a part of the Radio Shack chain, so there was no sign that said Radio Shack on the marquee. but he sold Radio Shack products, what used to be called Tandy products. Primarily, I think he sold other things as well, as I recall, but primarily Radio Shack products. And he said to me, he said, Mark, I cannot afford to stay open. I can't compete with Kmart and Walmart. And I put my head down and I said, so you are being affected by this too? And he said, yes. He shut down his store, got a job working in Kmart or Walmart. That was it. I'm sure he wasn't making anywhere the amounts of money as he was making when he had his own store. He had no employees in his store. It was just him. So you really could not call him a capitalist because he had no workers. It was just him who worked in the store. I saw that happening more and more and more. And right now in 2024, there are very, very few simply local stores. You go into a mall, especially, and you see mall stores, no matter what mall you go to, doesn't matter where it is. In my experience, the same thing is true in Canada. The same stores. There are mall stores, regardless of where you go. So everything has become globalized. The same thing, as I understand it, is even true in other countries. For example, in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. You go into shopping malls there, and you see the same stores there as you do in shopping malls in the United States and Canada. So what that has done is it has turned the earth, as one writer colorfully put it, into a flat earth. It's kind of a joke that the flat earth hypothesis, which really has not been a hypothesis for a long time. There are a lot of misconceptions about that, which I'll briefly mention in a second. But the flat earth hypothesis has turned out to be true because everything is flat. Everything looks exactly the same anywhere you go. Now, what did I mean by the flat earth hypothesis a long time ago? Many people think that when Columbus was traveling to what he thought was the West Indies, that people of that time believed that the earth was flat. Not true at all. Not true at all. The flat earth hypothesis had been abandoned a long time before then. A long time before then. There was no flat earth hypothesis when Columbus traveled ultimately to the Americas. Didn't exist anymore. Pardon me while I do what I said I would do and take a little bit of this cola. Interestingly, this cola is sold by a company called HEB, which is a supermarket chain here in the Rio Grande Valley. And as far as I know, it is only in the Rio Grande Valley, although I might be mistaken on that. And there are no other supermarket chains here except for the Walmart supermarkets that now fill the United States. But that's the only supermarket that we have here, and it's a large one. They also sell clothing, variety of other things too, but it's primarily a supermarket. Okay. So we now have a true global capitalist market, which has genuinely filled the world. That's what capitalism is now. It's not local capitalism, it's global capitalism. So, continuing now with our discussion of intersectional Marxism, and then we will relate that to the situation between Israel and Gaza in a little bit. That is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the flat earth now, where everything has become a part of a single market, a single global market. When I go onto Amazon or eBay or wherever, if I buy a product, unless I want to look carefully at where the product is made and being shipped from, I will never know. It doesn't matter anymore. Products can be made anywhere and sold anywhere. So I might be buying a product from China, from India, from Canada, from Britain, or from here in the US, and not know the difference because it literally does not matter anymore. That is the way in which capitalism operates today. So when we take that notion of intersectionality as referring to this kind of global capitalist market, which now exists and which now covers the earth, we see it all over the world, but not to the same degree. In other words, there are some parts of the world which may have some of those stores, but not as many. Or it may have all of those stores, but only a handful of people can afford to shop in them. The stores are very, very expensive in terms of the salaries or wages that people are paid in those areas. When I was in Congo, in Central Africa, I was in Kinshasa. At that time, Kinshasa was the most expensive city in sub-Saharan Africa. Did it look that expensive? Well, when walking down the main street, it looked like a regular American or European street with the same basic stores, pretty much, not much different than what you would see here. But then you walk behind the downtown area, and what do you see? Shanty towns. That's it, shanty towns. People walking around with bloated bellies. But you don't even need to walk behind the downtown area. You can simply walk down the main street in Kinshasa and you see dead bodies lining the streets. People dying of starvation. So intersectionality tells us that what capitalism has done is it has created a single market, sure. But what it has also done is it has created greater global inequality than has ever existed in the past. It used to be, going back a couple of hundred years, that anywhere you went was pretty much the same in the sense that most places were relatively poor. But now There are some areas, especially in the first world, which are predominantly wealthy by global standards, meaning even a poor person in the United States is by global standards pretty well off, maybe not that well off, but pretty well off, not as bad off as people are in Congo with bloated bellies laying dead in the streets. Those differences can be attributed to the various intersections of capitalism, those various thoroughfares, as I prefer to call them, which include things like race, gender, ethnicity, education, income, occupational status, and so on. Those are the thoroughfares. And when we compare one country, for example, take the United States, with another country, take Mexico, just 2 miles to my south, there is no comparison. Here on the US side, and I am in Hidalgo County, which is the warmest county in the state of Texas. It's pretty much spring or summer year-round. I am on the same latitude as Miami, Florida. Here in Hidalgo County, there is a lot of corruption. Much of it is medical corruption, but not exclusively. There are a lot of other kinds of corruption as well. But it is nothing compared to what happens when you cross over the Rio Grande Valley River, the Rio Grande River, onto the Mexican side, which is a continuation of the Rio Grande River. I mean, topologically, it looks the same, but that's about it. I mean, you go over to Reynosa, and someday I will get to Reynosa. I haven't gone there yet because people try to talk me out of it. They say, you go over there, you have a really good chance of being decapitated. That is true. That is true. And so when I go there, I want to make sure that I go there with someone who is familiar with the area. I don't want to just go there by myself. First, sadly, I know no Spanish. I wish I did, but I do not speak Spanish. I made the mistake of taking French in school, not Spanish, because I lived in New York, close to relatively close by 7 hours, New York City from Montreal. Montreal is a very popular destination for New Yorkers. It's a beautiful city, and most people there speak English and French, so it's a bilingual city. But it made me really want to learn French. I was always kind of a Francophile, meaning somebody who loved French and French culture, and I still am. But there's no use in being a Francophile here in the Rio Grande Valley. Hardly anybody here speaks French. It's kind of useless to me. What would be useful would be knowing Spanish. And sadly, there are two kinds of Spanish which create a kind of language barrier between the Mexican Americans on this side, the US side of the border, and the Mexicans just across the border in Mexico. Here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, people speak what I sometimes call a Tex-Mex Spanish, what could also be called, I suppose, Spanglish, a combination of Spanish and English. It's mostly Spanish. but a lot of English is thrown into it as well. When you cross over the border, there is no Spanglish, there is no Tex-Mex Spanish. And as a result, people from both sides of the border often have difficulty communicating with each other. In my condo complex, we have some people who are Mexican immigrants. They speak Mexican Spanish. The Mexican Americans, people whose ancestors may have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, they speak Tex-Mex Spanish or Spanglish. And in many cases, they literally cannot communicate with one another. We had a community meeting maybe about 6 months ago, held at the lodge for the community. And we had, of course, people like me who speak English. Then you had people who spoke Spanglish and people who spoke Mexican Spanish. And a fight, an argument, not literally a fight, but an argument erupted between the Mexican Americans and the Mexicans who immigrated to the United States. Why? Because they could not understand each other. Literally, it was as if they were speaking two different languages. And that is true. I mean, there's some overlap, but it's very difficult for people from both places to communicate with each other. So again, when you look at the comparison between Mexico and the US, just comparing, say, for example, right over the border here. If I cross over the border, in most areas, there is I don't know what the percentage would be, but there is a reasonable chance I might be decapitated or held for ransom. And if the ransom is not paid, then I would be decapitated. Or in some cases, even if the ransom is paid, I will still be decapitated. I don't know why I'm laughing. It's not funny. But it's very sad. The cartels are on both sides of the border. But on the Mexican side, the cartels are the ones who do the decapitations. They don't do decapitations here in the US, in Texas. They live in these large mansions right near me. I've seen them. Why they are not arrested by Border Patrol is a mystery to me. Now, Border Patrol, in case you don't know it, is often very corrupt. They are sometimes paid off by the cartels not to arrest them. Whether that is the reason, I don't know. But they're here. I mean, they're right here. I mean, I see them in shopping centers. They are very easily noticed by their style of dress. So anybody can tell, if you know what you're looking for, who is a cartel member. But they don't cause any harm to Americans. That's not what they're here for. They are here to collect the drugs as they have gone through the tunnel for Mexico. And there might, as far as I know, I don't know this personally, be one such tunnel a block away from me. I have no idea. I know there are tunnels right around here. And so the people in the cartels on the US side, they're Mexican, but they're not out to kill or to attack Americans. They're out to collect the drugs and then to serve as conduits to spread those drugs throughout North America. That's what they are here for. It's an entirely different world. Tremendous poverty in Mexico. There's poverty here too. This county is a pretty poor county. The Rio Grande Valley on the US side in Texas is relatively poor, but nothing like what you see on the Mexican side. It's an entirely different world. Not the same place. So we can take that notion of intersectional Marxism, meaning combining intersectionality with the notion of capital. And that capital is often generated by the cartels through the drug trade. I mean, even Border Patrol agents, police officers on the US side, in many cases, are bought and paid for by the cartels. Even more so on the Mexican side. Governments, local, even federal, are bought and paid for by the cartels. The cartels in Mexico run Mexico, and there is no prospect of that changing anytime soon. It is very, very sad to me. I wish there was something that I could do about it, but sadly, there really is not. And so, again, that is an example of how you can take intersectional Marxism or Marxist intersectionality and apply it to a very concrete situation, one which surrounds me right now. The drug trade. It is capitalism. I mean, illegal capitalism, but it's still capitalism. It's generating capital for the cartel members. The cartels are capitalists. They're capitalist organizations, and there are different cartels, and they all compete with each other. It's kind of like people in the US would talk about the Crips and the Bloods. Basically, that's what they are. They're gangs. They're gangs of people who sell drugs. That's how they make their living. Maybe like the motorcycle gangs in the US, which also, in many cases, make their money by selling drugs. So calling them cartels puts a different word on it. But is it really that much different from what exists in the US, like with the Crips and the Bloods or the motorcycle gangs? Yes and no. Yes, because in both cases, you're talking about selling drugs and raising capital in that way. No, because in the US, the cartels or the gangs do not run the US. But in Mexico, they do. They run Mexico. So in that sense, there is a considerable difference between Mexico and the US. That is intersectional Marxism. In other words, not just focusing in a very general sense on intersectionality or a roadmap, which was originally described by Kimberly Crenshaw and then later by Patricia Hill Collins as race, class, and gender, as if race, class, and gender should be placed on a level playing field. Not at all. That is simply not true. Intersectionality is class. That is the basic element of intersectionality. Class, or capitalism, or the capitalist world system, which is what the selling of drugs, the drug trade, is about, whether it's in Mexico or here in the US. The US, basically, the consumers of the drugs which are produced in Mexico. So I really don't know what else I can say about that. Perhaps that is enough as a way of demonstrating how intersectional Marxism can be used as a tool of Maoism third worldism. The main thing to keep in mind is that intersectional Marxism is not the same as the intersectionality which was proposed by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor. Kimberly Crenshaw is a leftist. I think she's like 2 years younger than me, if I'm correct on that. But she is not a Marxist. She is not a communist. I don't know what she would call herself, so I'm not going to put a label on her. But I can say that she is definitely not a Marxist or a communist. If she were, she would not put race, class, and gender into a straight line as if they are all equivalent to each other. She would recognize that class is the underlying substructure of the entire system. Likewise with Patricia Hill Collins, she would recognize that class or global capitalism is the substructure underlying the entire system. And yet neither of them recognize that. As a result, many Marxists, I think, are missing out on something that is very, very useful, and that is intersectionality. By limiting themselves to the intersectionality of Crenshaw and Collins, by focusing only on that, and by not focusing on the fact that there are many, many applications of intersectionality which are not those of Crenshaw and Collins, and that a number of them, including the one that I use and I have presented to you just now, are Marxist. So I hope that that will be a useful, I want to say lesson, but that sounds kind of demeaning, useful information for you, and that you can take that information and perhaps, if you are a Maoist third worldist, consider applying intersectional Marxism to your Maoism third worldism. Because in my humble opinion, IMHO, as we write sometimes in text messages and on bulletin boards and in chat rooms, in my humble opinion, intersectional Marxism can be seen as almost indispensable to a Maoism third worldism, which is capable of recognizing the tremendous disparities which exist between one country and another country, and which props up the power and the position of the first world. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.